Hi, I'm Gene Preston. I do wind and solar studies on ERCOT, and I was going to present this presentation back in April, and I was going to talk about pushing renewables to the max with gas backup. But during the period between April and August, I had a chance to give a presentation to the IEEE concerning ERCOT's reliability. And what I found is that ERCOT is short on generation into the future. So I'm going to modify my second item to be, how do we keep the lights on as we push renewables? I wish to thank the Climate Solutions community of AICI and the Engineering, Science, and Technology Council of Houston for giving me a chance to talk about decarbonizing transportation and decarbonizing the electric power supply here in Texas. How do we know that global warming is real? Well, we just plot the temperature over a number of years here, and we see that the global average temperature is rising. What happens if we take no action? Well, it's kind of like what happens with this sailor who was watching the wind increasing and thought, do I need to take action? Surprise, I waited too long. And so the boat tips in the water. So the story here is, if you're just thinking about there's a need to take action on climate change, you probably need to take action on climate change right now. We see that the large CO2 emitters are cars and electric power. There are about 38 quads, or about 38% of the heat energy is used for electric power, and about 28 quads, or about 28% for transportation. There were about 101 quadrillion BTUs used in 2018. We're going to need to estimate how much electrification of transportation will add to the electric grid. But before we do that, I would like to introduce you to electric cars are moving into the mainstream right now. I've owned a Tesla Model 3 for a couple of years now, and I've been keeping up with the technology. And I have to say I'm sorry that Tesla is really the only car that is absolutely top-notch for electric cars. And I'd like to introduce you to some of the features that Tesla has. They're going to soon announce that there's a 1,000,000-mile battery. Elon has promised this for September the 22nd. We have John Goodenough, who has a patent at the University of Texas on a new silicon solid-state battery. And it's my understanding that the new Maxwell technology battery will also be solid state and probably use a lot of silicon. Silicon holds more energy than the conventional lithium ion batteries. It still has lithium ion, but the silicon battery will be solid state, lower cost, higher energy density, and last longer. These electric cars have very powerful motors. My Tesla Model 3 is 450 horsepower, 2 motors, one in the front, one in the back. There's no annual servicing of the car. I have 14,000 miles. It's only been into the shop one time, and that's because I had a bumper that was damaged by somebody running into me while I was parked. If your Tesla has a problem, maybe Tesla can fix it remotely just through the computer network, or they will actually come out to your house and repair your car. Or you can take your car to a service center. There's a service center here in Austin. Electric cars have lower cost energy. Even when you get the energy off the grid, it's still about half the cost of gasoline. So electricity is cheaper than gasoline for powering the car. The Tesla has an advanced onboard computer that's tied to the internet all the time. Elon has his own private network. There are supercharging stations all over the United States. These stations start out charging at about 600 miles per hour. And then as the battery gets more fully charged, they slow down. I think the batteries gets a bit warm, and also as the batteries charge up, they can't be charged quite as fast. So But you can expect to start out charging at a really high rate of speed. So maybe you could add 100 miles in a few minutes, 15 minutes or so. Now, right after I bought my Tesla, I drove to New Orleans to the AICI meeting last year. And the computer calculates that I will need to stop at these points. These are supercharging points along the way. So it's a few minutes here. And then there's like 55 minutes recommended here. Well, what you do is you eat lunch. And then, so you eat lunch while it's charging up. And then you're charging in at Lake Charles. And then what you do is you stay overnight at Baton Rouge. You can't go all the way into New Orleans because there's no supercharging stations in New Orleans. So you drive from Austin to Baton Rouge, and then the next morning you drive into New Orleans. Well, when you're parked at Baton Rouge, you're charging overnight, so there's really no time involved. Now, here's what my car looks like at the Three Rivers station. These are charging stations. That's all there is to it. These service stations are quite cheap for Tesla to build. It's not much involved, no tanks or anything like that involved. So inside the Tesla, the interior is quite minimal. There's just a screen. There's a few buttons on the steering wheel. You can't even open the glove compartment without hitting a button on the screen. So there's nothing. There's no switches or anything in here. It's very, very clean. When you put the car in reverse, you get these stripes, so you can just look at the screen on the computer and you can back up. You actually don't have to even look in the rearview mirror. There's a lot of advanced screen displays like this energy usage as you're driving. When you're driving the car, you always know whether you're going to make your destination or not, how much energy you're going to have, when you're going to arrive, so forth. We're going to need to calculate the additional electric transportation load. Electric vehicles are more efficient than internal combustion engine cars. The Tesla Model 3 has an equivalent EPA rating of about 130 miles per gallon, which translates to 3.8 miles per kilowatt hour. And when you actually look at the energy usage of the cars, that's about how many miles you get per kilowatt hour. A Toyota Camry is roughly equivalent in size to a Tesla Model 3, and it gets 41 miles per gallon. There are cars that get better than 41 miles per gallon, and there are cars that don't get as good as 41 miles per gallon. So, but I just chose a Camry as sort of a typical equivalent car. The ERCOT, or Electric Reliability Council of Texas, load average is about 45 gigawatts or 45,000 megawatts annually. So if you had a constant ERCOT load of 45,000 megawatts for 8760 hours, that would be an energy content. This is about equal to the total energy that's consumed in ERCOT, total electric energy consumed. So a giant leap here is to assume that the ratio of 41 to 130 holds for all electric vehicles and all cars. We're going to use that ratio. So one electric vehicle load estimate that we could use for adding to the grid energy is we could take the 45 gigawatts that are currently used in ERCOT, and we could ratio the transportation to quads of electrification, electric grid, and also ratio that by the energy efficiency of the two cars, and we would get roughly 10.5 gigawatt load average that would be added to the electric grid. Let's do a sanity check. 22 million Teslas driving 16,000 miles per year in Texas would also be a load of about 11 gigawatts. So those are roughly in agreement. Another sanity check is that for the average electric customer using 18,000 kilowatt hours annually, this would add 4195 kilowatt hours, which is about 16,000 miles per year. So looking at it from the customer end, number of cars, ratioing two different cars and the energy in quads, we're getting roughly the same amount of energy we would add to the grid. Now, conversion of trucks, buses, and trains would add more load, But then again, we would save energy by not having processing plants for manufacturing gasoline and sales there. So maybe those two things cancel each other out. But we have another problem. ERCOT in 2027 may not be reliable enough to supply very much load. In fact, it's not even reliable enough to even supply our electric load. We've got two kinds of problems in the ERCOT grid right now. We have transmission line problems, and then we have power supply problems. I'm going to talk about the transmission line problems that are currently appearing in ERCOT. I do point of injection transmission constraint studies for wind and solar plants, and we're finding it's harder and harder to find points of interconnection for new solar plants. This means that we have a landowner who wants to put in a solar plant, maybe 100 megawatts, and there's a transmission nearby, transmission line, and they want to tap into that line. So the kind of study I do is I take a load flow case. A load flow is an electrical model, and I inject the power into that point of interconnection, and then we look for line overloads and voltage problems. And you can never second guess the results. Sometimes there's a lot of transmission capacity and sometimes there isn't. But in the later years, it's becoming harder to find locations where there's good capacity available. Now, ERCOT is doing a new kind of study called the Generic Transmission Constraints Limits. These are stability studies where they look at the grid in little time slices, and they have various problems that might happen in the grid. There might be a transmission line that's outaged or something like that. And then if they find that the grid starts oscillating in an unstable manner, and that this oscillation becomes worse if there's too much power flowing on the transmission lines, then they have to put a constraint on the amount of power flowing through the transmission system. I may not see this problem in my studies because I'm only looking at the thermal or the maximum current in the wires. But ERCOT has found that maybe about 4 gigawatts is about the maximum power you can get out of the panhandle. And a recent study shows that there's about 11 gigawatts maximum that you can get out of all of West Texas before they run into this stability problem. Now, in the planning cases, there could easily be 35 gigawatts of wind and solar in West Texas by 2027. Now, this wind and solar is very unlikely that it will be running at maximum output all the time, or even some of the time. But some of the time, it will have output that exceeds 11 gigawatts. You could build new transmission lines to deliver more power, but it's unlikely that new lines will be built because ERCOT spent a lot of money on what's called CREZ lines, which built out a 345 kV grid for serving wind in West Texas, and those CREZ lines are now finished. There's another transmission problem that's not associated with moving power across the grid, but it's associated with moving power into load areas. So as older gas and coal plants that are close to the cities are retired, these are in cities such as Dallas, Fort Worth area, Austin, San Antonio, and Houston, the transmission lines feeding power into those cities causes a rather dangerous dependency on the transmission system. So if we trip these lines, we could overload other lines and result in a cascading outage of that load area. Now, looking at this on a map makes a little more sense. So we could draw a line here for the maximum power out of the panhandle. That's 4 gigawatts. There's actually at least 10 gigawatts of wind potential in the Panhandle. And then recently ERCOT did this GTC study for all the generation out here. There's a lot of generation out here, wind and solar. Solar is fantastic out here because there's fewer clouds, more sunshine, and it also peaks. The sun peaks later in the day because it's west of the load centers. So it's very desirable to put solar plants out here, but the problem is we have trouble getting that solar power back to the load centers. And then of course each load center has an import constraint problem. All of these load centers have import constraint problems that currently exist, and they're getting worse. Now I need to talk about the power supply problem that ERCOT has. This is a new problem that's been growing recently. Reserve generation capacity, by definition, is an excess of generation above the peak demand to be served. Now, the reserve capacity in ERCOT's been dropping. Reserve margins were high in the 1980s when new coal and nuclear plants were coming online to replace gas. We did have gas shortage in the 1970s. So we were trying to transition to coal and nuclear to improve the reliability of the supply. In the 1990s, deregulation made generation planning a market activity, which ERCOT's role now is to just oversee the market. So basically, there's no central agency that does generation planning in ERCOT. Around 2005, gas fracking became available, which lowered the cost of gas, and that caused a rapid growth in merchant gas power plants. And for a while, the reserve margin remained high. We're talking about much higher than the 13% that used to be considered as the desirable margin for a reliable grid. Now, wind and solar are growing considerably in ERCOT, and the energy from these plants is displacing natural gas and coal plants' energy sales. And these gas and coal plants are being retired, especially the older ones. They're not efficient enough to compete with lower cost energy. Lower cost energy being wind and solar. Fortunately, the nuclear is hanging in there because basically we built our nuclear plants before deregulation, and so the capital cost of nuclear was handled before deregulation. Panda is an example of a failure in the energy market. It is a new gas plant, and they thought that ERCOT was going to be short on capacity, and so they built a new gas plant, but it didn't generate sufficient revenue to pay for the plant. And so now they have sued ERCOT, and the lower courts have determined that ERCOT is not responsible for Panda's problems. But Panda's taking the case to the Supreme Court, and it's still being decided on as to whether Panda was harmed by what ERCOT told him. In the course of updating my computer files to current years 2017 through 2019, I made a discovery about ERCOT's data, and I reported this to the IEEE. And let me describe to you some of the details. This gets a little bit technical, but see if you can follow along here. We're going to use load flow programs. Now, a load flow is an electrical model. ERCOT posts data on their website that describes all the components that go into the load flow, which is transmission lines, their impedances, power plants, loads megawatts, reactive powers, all the electrical information you need to run what's called a steady state solution. So The load flows that we're going to be interested in are the summer peak or the peak load flows for future years. And I'm going to be looking at years 2018, 2019, 2021, 2023, and 2027. So in 2018, the load flow case data was posted by ERCOT on February in 2018. And when I ran that load flow through my electrical model, I could observe that the total amount of power going into the transmission system from all the sources was 83,219 megawatts, which includes more load and generation than what ERCOT lists in their load and generation files, because there's private use networks and there's losses and there's several things. But the electrical network, when you saw the electrical network I saw, this was the total amount of power that was needed. And in that load flow case, the sources, there were different kinds of sources. There was solar, wind, and then there was nuclear, 4,981 megawatts of nuclear, and 73,417 megawatts of fossil fuel sources that were in that case. The wind in that particular case was 21,744 megawatts nameplate rating, but the wind was reduced in output so that the average wind was running at 24%. Now, ERCOT does not run all the wind at 24%. They'll run coastal wind, in this case, at 58%, because there's about a 58% chance, or there's an average of the wind during the peak load hours that you can depend on the wind on the coast to be about a 58%, but that's only 2,000 or 3,000 megawatts. Then they have some wind that's not quite on the coast, but close to the coast, and they may run that up to 50% in the load flow case. And then the rest of the wind that's very distant from the coast, they should have it at 14.2%. It was decided in 2013 that the non-coastal wind should be run at 14.2%. But if you look in the load flow, you find that they are running that non-coastal wind a bit higher than 14.2%. And so the amount that they're running that wind above 14.2% is 921 megawatts. They needed a little extra generation. By the way, they're running solar at about 75% in all these cases. There was 1,242 megawatts nameplate rating of solar in 2018. They needed a little bit of extra power in the load flow case in order to solve the case. They basically had all of the fossil fuel plants and the nuclear plant running wide open in the case. They didn't have quite enough generation, so they pulled a little extra here on the wind. So I have a little hourly program. I call it PS4. It's pump storage, but you can use it for battery storage too. It's an energy storage program. I'm not going to use it for energy storage in these cases though, but what I am going to do is I'm going to take the ERCOT historical hourly profiles for the load, wind, and solar. ERCOT posts some nice files of wind, load, solar. Every hour they tell you the megawatts output average for years 2017, 2018, and 2019. So I have those files, which I had pulled from the ERCOT website, and I had those handy. So using 83,219 megawatts as the load in that particular case. I can sweep forward through 2019. I'm only going to look at 2019 data here, even though I have the other years. I'm just going to look at 2019. And the program sweeps through the period, and there are no hours in using 2019 profiles with 2018 data. The load is served every hour. Now this is entirely deterministic. There are no random forced outages of power plants. We assume that all power plants are running and available. There are no transmission lines that are forced out. There are no problems at all in this model. We're just going to do a deterministic sweep. And the program said there were no shortages in 2018. So I looked at 2019 data. That case was posted in October of 2018. It is a forecast of 2019 conditions. In that case, they had 85,213 megawatts total power requirement going into the grid. There was some growth. There was some growth in the load. There was a bit of retirement. Look, there's 1,000 megawatts of gas plant retirement here, or maybe it was a coal plant. I don't know. And also the nuclear plant was slightly derated. This number, by the way, also includes the north and east DC type powers coming into ERCOT. Notice the wind has increased here. There's more installed wind in this case, and there's more installed solar. However, ERCOT had to increase the non-coastal wind above the 14.2%. Just to solve the load flow, they had to increase that wind to by 2275 megawatts above what it should have been running. Now, the interesting thing is that when I run this case through my program, I see there are 2 days of shortage. And I thought, well, that's interesting because there were actually 2 days of emergency condition that actually occurred in ERCOT. So I thought, well, that's interesting. Here I'm doing a deterministic study, and I'm seeing the same 2 days, August 13th and August 15th, as shortage in this very simplistic analysis. So it made me wonder, well, what if I keep going into the future? What am I going to see? So I did 2021. Load is growing, 93,000 megawatts. Notice that the fossil fuels and nuclear are pretty static. They're not changing much. More wind, more solar, and they've also had to scale up the non-coastal wind. But now the deterministic program I'm running, PS4, it predicted there were 18 days of deficiency. I thought, that's kind of high. What did the other years look like? 2023, 98,000 megawatts came in at 32 days of deficiency. So I said, well, good grief, this is a bad trend. ERCOT recently posted in June of 2020, a new 2027 case. It has 104,000 megawatts peak requirement for all the resources. It's got almost 36,000 megawatts of wind, but they had to scale the non-coastal wind up to 11,000 megawatts in order to have enough generation to meet the load just for the peak case. Now keep in mind that my hourly sweep through the system does not do this scaling right here because I'm taking the actual profiles of 2019 and using those. Anyway, the program said there were 54 days that we would be deficient. So let's see what I've got here. There must be enough generation at all times to serve load and losses. So I'm just describing what I did here. The discovery is made that the deficiency gets progressively worse in future years. By 2027, there are 54 days out of the year where emergency load reductions are projected to be needed. This is not what you would call a reliable system even before the electric load is added. I meant to say in that previous slide, we have not added the transportation load yet. Here's a graph of what that 2019 year looks like. Now, I'm only going to graph the load levels for loads that are greater than 70% of the peak. Now, the 1 right here represents a peak demand of 1 per unit. The reason why the load doesn't go up to 1 per unit is because we're subtracting wind and solar every hour from the native load. And when you subtract the wind and solar every hour from the native load, you wind up with this red curve here. And we have to serve this load with fossil generation and nuclear power. And in 2019, there were a couple of hours where we were slightly deficient. The deterministic analysis was off by about 1650 megawatts below the actual ERCOT shortage during these 2 hours on August 13th and August 15th. During these 2 hours in 2019, the grid prices went to $9,000 per megawatt hour. So what does the future look like? Let's go to 2027. Well, the load level was higher. The actual megawatts of fossil and nuclear generation was about the same. And even though we had more wind and solar in that case, we have occurrences. We actually have 54 days here where we don't have enough generation to serve these loads. This doesn't represent a reliable system. And we're going to need, I mean, we can't expect nuclear to be constructed between now and 2027. So we're going to have to solve this problem pre-nuclear somehow or another. And I'm going to talk about those next. So what are our options? Maybe the most obvious option would be to just add more gas capacity, particularly gas peakers, maybe unmanned gas plants. We would need about 12,000 megawatts of new gas capacity. But this doesn't look very likely now. Previously in April, I would have reported that as we add renewables, we would be adding new gas capacity. But there's a number of reasons why the gas capacity is not likely to show up. The renewables are displacing the energy sales. So the new gas plants are selling less and less energy. There are too many idle hours for operators to be sitting around. I mean, some of these simulations that show that deep penetrations of renewables could leave operators idle all year long. Maybe they only need the plant every other year. That's not reasonable to expect operators to be sitting in a power plant all year long doing nothing. There's also opposition to new fossil fuel plants. We had a general manager in Austin who wanted to build a new high efficiency gas plant at Decker, and his ideas were not acceptable, so he left. And the plans now are to retire the remaining gas plants in Austin. We have 735 megawatts of Decker plant are being retired, and we have about the same amount of capacity in various other gas plants, which are desired to be retired, except that we have a problem because we only have enough transmission for about 2,000 megawatts of import. So we really need these gas plants inside our area to pick up the load if we have problems with the transmission system. If we retire all of the gas plants inside Austin, we can't serve the load during the peak because Austin's load's going up to about 3,000 megawatts, and that was before Tesla announced their Gigafactory. Also, financing is becoming difficult because of climate change, financing fossil fuel plants. The new plants are located too far from the load centers, so we have this import problem of getting power into the load areas. And so gas plants that are located remotely from the load centers aren't much value. Maybe that's what was wrong with Panda. It wasn't close enough to a load area. The unmanned plants are a bit too small. Enchanted Rock has these small unmanned gas plants located at HEB grocery stores. You can look this up on the internet. They have about 300 megawatts of backup power gas plants scattered around the state. They did a wonderful job of rescuing Houston when the hurricane was in there and the electric power was off. The gas plants allowed the grocery stores to stay open, probably prevented starvation from happening. Also, litigation is still active on the Panda plant. That's a real damper for somebody else wanting to build a new gas plant. They're looking at Panda, you know, why couldn't they make the plant work? They're going to have the same kind of problem if they build a new gas plant. Another problem with gas is the future gas supply is ultimately limited. Someday we're going to burn up that gas, and then what do we do? There are other near-term options for better grid reliability. We could add more wind and solar. I ran the 2027 case and I had to add 99 gigawatts of wind and 58 gigawatts of solar to get that number down to 0 days per year. Well, that's way too much wind. We're never going to be able to add that much wind in ERCOT. We might be able to add a lot of solar, but we're going to have a lot of transmission problems if we try to add that much solar. It's not possible to add this much renewables because we have limited transmission. It's also very difficult to build new transmission lines. Imagine a whole bunch of new power lines coming into Austin. Believe me, there will be a lot of opposition. Building these new transmission lines is just as hard as building a nuclear power plant. Now, battery storage is good for daily storage, like in your electric car, but battery storage is not suitable for seasonal storage. One of the problems with non-coastal wind is that it produces maximum energy during the off-peak periods, spring and fall, where we have more wind blowing, but we don't have the load. We need a way to store that energy, but we do not have a cheap way to store that energy. One thing that hurts the economics of seasonal storage is that you only use the storage infrequently, maybe once or twice a year. It turns out that the storage that's used daily, where you're pumping energy back and forth daily, is more economical because you're spreading that capital cost of that storage over more kilowatt hours. Another problem with battery storage is that it fails the test for load and generation separation. The current rules in ERCOT, which are federally mandated, require that loads be separated from generation. They don't even talk to each other. They have to be completely independent of each other. So here you have a battery, which 1 hour it's bringing in power, so it looks like a load, and the next hour it's supplying power to the grid, so it's generation. So this is a problem that's currently being looked at legally and hasn't been resolved yet in the US or even in Texas. Grid storage is not financeable in our energy market. We have no way to pay for the cost of storage in an energy market. The price differences are not great enough to pay for the battery storage. We might possibly utilize the storage in electric vehicles as V2G. That's vehicle to grid. In other words, the utilities have the power to extract power from the vehicles and put power back into the vehicles. But because these electric vehicles have somewhat of a limited life on their batteries, there hasn't been a desire to do that. So this is not happened. It's something that academics study, but doesn't happen in the real world. So what about demand side management? That's where we trim the load when the price goes up. Renewables are only intermittently available. In other words, we would like to use renewable power when it's available, but it's only intermittently available. We couldn't turn the air conditioning load off at times, but the magnitude of the load that has to be shed in 2027 is just way beyond what we can do with air conditioning load. We can shift the timing of non-critical loads. I have a swimming pool. I can run it during the daytime with solar power, or I could run it at nighttime with wind, but there's no electrical connection between my water pumps on my swimming pool and the grid. The infrastructure has not been set up yet. Sending grid price signals to customers is what the economists want to do, but what this does is it just transfers the problem down to the customer level when the grid is short on capacity. Because of this shortage of capacity at times, with the grid prices going high in the future, the customers may have to install their own gas and solar backup power. The grid problems are certain. What we don't yet know how to do is to add this backup power to the customer's level yet. Also, there are utility rules that limit innovation. Austin may think that they have a nice solar program, but when you dig into the specifics, you find that Australia's rooftop solar only costs half what Austin's cost. And the primary difference are all the rules, inspections, everything that you have to do to put in solar in Austin is just more expensive because there's just more rules, extra meters, extra wiring. It just all adds up. What we really need is we need a way for low-income people to have solar, but it's not going to happen because the way the rules are set up, the more expensive installations are the more economical. And so we wind up with rich people can install solar at their homes, but poor people can't. That really bothers me. Okay, those are the rules that are preventing low-cost solar. So in near-term options for a better grid, we could send price signals to customers, but that's equivalent to selling customers energy without a guarantee for reliable service. The problem is basically dumped on the users. Many electric users will add backup generation if the grid is unreliable. Customers with backup generation will cut their ties to the grid when the prices rise too high. For instance, the Tesla Powerwall customers can cut their tie to the grid. This is right now. When they purchase power from griddy energy and the price of the energy goes too high. This happened to the griddy customers who had power walls were able to ride through those price spikes that griddy would have charged that customer because they just disconnected for a few hours. Near-term options for better grid reliability. Getting power into the cities is a big problem. Before 1965, cities had local gas and coal generation. New transmission interconnected cities after 1965 blackout. The FERC ordered the interconnection of load areas and generation to grid up the system to make it more reliable. The coal and nuclear plants distant from load centers use the new transmission lines, loading them up, like Fayette plant and the South Texas project. And then later, new wind and solar, also remote from loads, is displacing and retiring older gas and coal plants. The retirement of these gas and coal plants near the load centers is causing line overloads near the load centers. These transmission problems are limiting how much power can be imported from all remote generators. It doesn't matter whether it's wind, solar, coal, or nuclear, or gas. There's an import limitation problem. I'm going to use my PS4 program now to show you a possible solution for 2027 that does not involve nuclear. So in this computer program, we have the 2019 profiles for load, wind, and solar. And then when I run the program, I'm going to enter by hand. I'm going to type in the peak demand. There's no electric vehicles in this case. Hydro, no hydro. The wind that's planned, or the wind that's in the load flow case. And I'm going to increase the solar from about 12,000, well actually from 884 up to 25,000 megawatts. And I'm going to add 9,000 megawatts for 1 hour battery storage. And here we have our nuclear. And when I run this program, it comes back and tells me that I'm going to need to add 72,355 megawatts of gas. Well, that's exactly how much gas that's in that load flow case. So I haven't retired any gas at all in the case, but because every hour was met and served, because there was enough nuclear and gas here, there's no loss of load in this case. There are no days where I wasn't able to serve the load. And in this case, the renewable energy is 32% of the total energy. The gas capacity factor is 45%. 60% of gas energy goes to serve load. The total amount of gas cost here is $201 billion. What the program assumes is it's going to add 10 years of gas burning at $40 per megawatt hour. It's just hardwired into the program and added on as a cost. And the total cost of this plan is $475 billion. It's just basically taking the components here and adding up the current cost. This is kind of a present value. Notice there's no extra electric vehicle load in this simulation. Can Tesla provide the EV energy? I don't know. Let's look at a nuclear solution. This is another scenario. Now what I did in this scenario is I reduced the wind to 24 gigawatts, which is current. In other words, we don't have any new, between now and 2027, we don't have all that new wind. I dropped the solar from 11,000 down to about 10,000 megawatts. And I added 20,000 megawatts of base-loaded new nuclear. Now this nuclear assumed here is like Charles Forsberg's thermal storage nuclear, and we're going to extract thermal storage energy to follow the seasonal load. There's a seasonal load problem with nuclear. The load level is too light in the non-summer months. You would have to have too much capacity in nuclear. So you could call it smart nuclear. It's going to have to be staged so that about half the nuclear can run all the time, and the other half is going to be for the summer. I told the program with this minus sign to make this nuclear load following. And even though I told it to do load following, that means it dispatches after wind and solar. So that means we use all the wind and solar. There's no lost energy in wind and solar here. It's still 88% capacity factor. But in this model, it says that gas is now down to 17%, and we've retired a lot of gas. Now we're at 47,764 instead of 73,000 megawatts. This case is actually cheaper at $452 billion than the case without the nuclear. So you could say, well, this is completely logical, because what we can do is we can build these nuclear plants around the system where we're retiring coal plants. Now this doesn't mean we're going to build these nuclear plants way out in the boondocks, because that would create the same kind of problem that we're having with wind and solar. They're too far away from the loads. But I just wanted to illustrate here that we can make nuclear work easily if we just build the generation. I didn't assume a real low capital cost either on this nuclear power. The most useful kinds of nuclear for ERCOT, we have Charles Forsberg's thermal storage nuclear, where he calls it the hot rocks storage. Could provide 20 gigawatts of base generation, 20 gigawatts of peaking or load following. This would eliminate the need for battery storage on the grid, because we're basically going to be extracting this energy as we need it on the grid. Maybe not to follow load, but seasonally, because we still had 47,000 megawatts of gas. Now there's another option. Per Peterson's nuclear plant design has 12 off-the-shelf turbines. This is supposed to cut the cost per reactor, which could be used for seasonal generation as well as meeting all of the spinning and responsive reserve requirements. Peterson's design is innovative in that he runs these turbines at only 100 megawatts, even though the turbines are rated at 240. So if you have a disturbance on the grid where you need extra power, and this is just during an emergency, you can inject this gas into these turbines and they will ramp up instantly or just immediately to higher power levels to serve the load until you have time to redispatch the generation. So you can basically carry all your spinning reserve and responsive reserve in just a couple of these plants. It's fantastic in the model. It works great. The IFR, integral fast reactor nuclear, which was almost commercial by 2010, and then we just decided to stop the research and development. It could provide thousands of years of nuclear fuel supply with little mining and waste. We have about 30 years of used fuel at STP, could be converted into 3,000 years of fuel in an IFR plant. Impediments to progress that need correcting. Problem: the energy market does not support capital investments in nuclear and storage. Solution: a new business model is needed that supports capital investments for climate change, grid reliability, and a cleaner environment. The rules preventing innovation need to be removed. We need to identify those rules and get rid of them. And there's a lot of self-serving rules here that are all over. They're like, I won't go into them, but there's just a lot of rules that are preventing innovation. Customers need to build in their own off-grid power supplies for improved resiliency. I'm thinking at my home that I can install solar panels which will power my car. It will charge my car off the grid. And I'm thinking that I can also run my cabana refrigerator and freezer off the grid. So that's a project I'm working on right now. And I'm also thinking that I have some pool pumps which circulate water in the swimming pool. I can put in 10 panels and I can run those motors off the grid. When the sun shines, the water circulates. When the sun doesn't shine, water doesn't circulate. That's okay. It doesn't matter when the water circulates, just every once in a while. So I could move maybe a fourth of my load off the grid. And that would give me the equivalent of net metering, which Austin Energy doesn't allow net metering. So this is an electronic way to get around the limitation. We need our governments to support nuclear power for research and development and also commercialization. We need the government support. They may not need to build the plants. We just need to have a friendly environment with the government. And with that, that is the end of my talk. Thank you very much.